Welcome everybody to this webinar. We're going to start very slowly because I can still see people coming in. I hope you can hear me and you can also see our slides. This webinar is part of the Karger webinar series. The topic of today's webinar will be quality control, the effect substandard submissions have on the publishing landscape. This webinar will be a discussion. I will get to our speakers in a second. Just for some slight introductions, my name is Julia. I will guide you through this webinar. Before we'd like to start, just some householding items. This webinar is going to be recorded. It will be made available to you after it is done. I will start with a very short introduction on who Karger is, on an introduction who our speakers are. Then we will go into the discussion. After the discussion, we will have time for a Q&A session. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please drop them in the chat box and we will get to them after the event. So, without further ado, I would say let's start. So, just a couple of words on Karger Publishers. We are a biomedical publisher. We've been around since 1890, so it's quite a long time. We are a family-owned business. Our publisher at the head is still Gabriela Karger. Our credo or motto is connecting and advancing health sciences. And for us, that means providing solutions along the full cycle of knowledge, solutions for any of the stakeholders in our industry, including authors, funders, institutions. So that's basically who we are. We've gone through quite a change over the past of the last couple of years. So we have changed from a content provider to being a service provider, especially in the context of open access. And this is also kind of why I am part of this webinar. Open access is something that I deal with a lot in my daily work. It's kind of my job to find solutions for Karger and for our academic customers, kind of solutions to transition towards open access in a reasonable amount of time and with reasonable solutions for each side. So much for where we are all coming from. So now it's my pleasure to actually introduce our speakers to you. And we will start with Raj. Professor Raj Raghupathy. He's the Karger Editor-in-Chief of the Karger Journal Medical Principles and Practice, which we will use as a case study for today's webinar. He's a professor at the Faculty of Medicine for Kuwait University, and as you can see, he's also an accomplished author, which puts him in a position where he can speak kind of wearing two pairs of shoes, which I think we can benefit from today very well. Our second speaker is Muna Kugler, who is the publication manager for Medical Principles and Practice. So she's kind of the counterpart at Karger for Raj's work, and she can say, or she can highlight the difficulties that we encounter on the publisher side when it comes to substandard submissions. Muna has a lot of experience with pharmaceutical industry. She has been at Karger since 2019. And last but not least, we have Gráinne. She has joined Karger this year. She's the Karger Manager for Research Integrity and Publications Ethics, which is quite a mouthful. She is based in London. As you can probably see, all of us are currently sitting at home. So if you hear all background noises or cats in the background, that is due to home office. And I hope you can excuse that. So Raj, I would like to invite you to speak a bit about medical principles and practice, if you can.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Kuwait to all of you. Medical principles and practice, or as we fondly refer to it, MPP, has been in existence for 32 years now. It started off as a local journal, became a regional journal, and now it's very comfortably an international journal with emphasis on medical and biomedical sciences. The editorial board is comprised of members from within the Health Sciences Center of Kuwait University, but we have an international advisory board. Our authors are international. We get more papers from outside Kuwait than from within Kuwait. Our reviewers are almost exclusively international. So we are an international journal of medicine and biomedical sciences, and our papers that we get range from basic sciences like chemistry, biochemistry, and microbiology, all the way to the various disciplines in medicine, to surgery and dentistry and public health. And we have a very pretty critical editorial board and pretty critical international peer reviewing, which has led us to go from a very low impact factor of 0.2 and 0.3 a decade ago to about 1.3 today. And my greetings to you all, and I'm looking forward to interacting with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raj. And I would suggest we dive right into the discussion. I have prepared a couple of questions, which I think are highly interesting to where we are right now. And I would say let's start with question number one. So question number one would be, how do each of you define substandard submissions? And can you give an example from your daily work?
Hi, everybody. I'm Gráinne. So from a research integrity perspective, I would broadly define substandard submissions as any manuscript that's lacking in sufficient information that would allow editors and reviewers to thoroughly review that manuscript. And that could be failure to include an ethics approval statement or a conflict of interest statement, or failure to include details about maybe the sample size and the number of participants that were used. So why is this important? So for example, say a manuscript is reporting the results from a clinical trial, and that clinical trial registration number isn't included in the manuscript. It isn't then possible to compare how the study was executed compared to the original study protocol. And in sum, it's really the insufficient information in the manuscript that it kind of impairs the editors and reviewers really thoroughly going through that manuscript and conducting a thorough peer review.
All right. Raj, do you have other points or other specific definitions of substandard submissions?
Sure. I'll put them into two categories. One is the quality of the manuscript in terms of the language, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that, except that a major challenge to even considering a paper is the language in which it's written. It does not have to be language in terms of big words, but it should be understandable. And then the formatting. Many a time an author will send a paper which has been rejected at another journal, and it's blindly submitted without reformatting according to the guidelines of our journal. But as a scientist, we look at it as scientists as well. If a manuscript has a very poor hypothesis, or if it has a very poor rationale, or if the results are not significant, that we would consider it substandard. Another reason for calling a manuscript substandard, it's not the best definition for what I'm going to say now, but if the paper is of extremely local interest, if it's going to be of interest only to a certain small town in a country, And if it's not of general interest to the readers across the world, we would consider it substandard, because it's only looking, for example, at nutritional habits of people in a certain village of a certain country. The rest of the world may not be deeply interested in that. And another reason for calling a journal, a paper, substandard is if the question is not of a particular significance to science or to medicine or to biomedical sciences. Plagiarized manuscripts, where a manuscript is submitted to one journal and without waiting for rejection or acceptance, it's submitted to our journal. And sometimes reviewers are quick at catching it because they say, hey, I just saw this paper last month, it came to me from another journal. That would be considered, of course, it's obviously plagiarism, it's unethical, and it's grounds for rejection. So these are the different reasons why, as a scientist, I would call a manuscript as substandard. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Muna, do you have examples from your perspective?
Yeah. Sure. Hello, everybody. My input to this this topic is basically papers that do not meet the publisher's requirements for publication, and to put it in a summary. So, and all of these requirements are on Karger's homepage and any other publisher's homepage as well. So in my opinion, if the authors would read these guidelines thoroughly, they would limit the percentage of rejection possibility due to formatting or due to presenting the science, applying all the necessary guidelines like the ethics approval. For me, I think authors should really thoroughly read the guidelines that are on our homepage, because they give you from A to Z everything you need to know in order to be able to be accepted. So as a summary.
All right, thank you very much. So if we move to question number 2, this is kind of an extension on question number 1. Question number 2 would be, can you name 2 of the most common shortcomings you find in substandard submissions? And will these automatically lead to rejections? Which I think is probably the question most interesting to a lot of authors. So, Raj, can we start with you?
Sure. Can you name 2 of the most common shortcomings? And Julia, you limited me to 2, but I'll mention a few, and then I'll tell you the 2 of my favorite pet peeves. I'll just start speaking as an author. What I've learned to do over the decades that I've been in science is, when I think of choosing a journal, I spend several minutes actually looking at the scope of the journal. And upfront, most journals, and Karger does it very nicely, MPP's got extensive description of the scope. Now, we come under the category of general medicine. So when I, as an author, as a potential author, look at a journal, I look at not just the first few pages of the guidelines, but I go through some of the articles to see, are they interested in the type of article that I wish to submit? And that homework pays a huge dividend at the end, because it can save me as an author several months of struggle and hardship and waiting time, etc. So when an author submits a paper to us, we can tell right up front that they have not really looked at the scope of our journal. They haven't looked at the guidelines, because they do what I call blind forwarding. Rejected, the same afternoon, they send it to our journal, and we realize that they have not looked at how references should be cited, the length of the manuscript, how many references we accept. We have a reference limit of 30 references. We have a page limit of 19 pages. So when we look at a manuscript which is 36 pages long and it has 48 references, and the references are all cited in superscript, we know that that's carelessness. If they had just taken a couple of days to reformat it, we would look at it with much more enthusiasm. So the biggest challenges as a science editor, I'm a scientist and I'm an author myself. So what we look at is is there a rationale? Is there a clearly defined rationale or hypothesis to this paper? Is it new information? And now, because Scopus and PubMed and Google allows us to look at papers published all over the world, we need only a few minutes to tell whether this is really new or whether there are 1,463 papers in the same field. Then we look at the significance of the results. And now we have two kinds of rejection. One is what we call an editor reject, where we look at the paper and we reject it within the first few days based on our decision. That is, my editor, Professor Ludmil Benov, and I, both of us take a look at the paper and we can reject it at the initial stage. Then we have what is called a reviewer rejection, which will take from weeks to months till we get the reviewers, experts, international experts in the field. So our two top reasons, shortcomings that can lead to rejection is extremely poorly formatted papers, which there is still a chance to resurrect the paper, to redeem the paper. And the second most important shortcoming for us would be a group of scientific reasons such as lack of clear rationale, extremely local interest, and lack of novelty, that it's just a rehashed paper. It's a Me Too kind of a paper, that this has been done in 46 countries, but it's the first time that we're doing it in my city or my university. Julia, I hope my explanation is clear, Julia.
It's very clear. I do have a follow-up question for you. However, I have been told that I think your camera is not switched on. Could you switch that on for me?
Sure.
My follow-up question would be, if you highlight these very specific articles, do you would one of the reasons why they are submitted to MPP be that an author has maybe not read the scope of the journal? And
Yes.
These articles that are very specific should probably go into other journals?
Absolutely, Julia. If a look, even a casual, cursory look at the scope will tell potential authors that we come under the category of general medicine. So if we see a paper that's extremely specialized in the field of orthopedic surgery, for example, or for example, we do accept dentistry papers, but if it's extremely specialized, that's going to appeal only to a few specialists in the field, obviously it should go to a specialist journal. So if the authors look at the scope of the journal, which is up front on the first few pages in the website, they'll know that this is a general medicine journal. So many times we send it back to the author and we say, thank you, the manuscript is interesting, but this should go to a specialized journal. So you're right, Julia. Not looking at the scope of the journal and our guidelines is one of the major shortcomings of papers.
All right. Mona, can we move on to you for this question?
I think Professor Raj said it all. I would just emphasize one or 2 points of what you said, Professor Raj, from my point of view as a publication manager. So certainly the non-primary research, we see that often, that these are papers that are not primary research, and editors don't bother to even look at them because they're not fulfilling the main criteria. The structure, the format, Professor Raj went through in a lot of detail, and I think here, if the science is there, the structure and the format would not be an object or would not hinder the manuscript to be approved, because some editors actually do take the time when they see the science is there, but the structure and the format and the way the science is presented is not as per I would like to see it or as per our requirements. So they would actually sit down and send it on to reviewers, and reviewers would get back to the authors and inform them that they need to rewrite and restructure, add some more information. So this is one example where not necessarily the paper does not necessarily get thrown out at the beginning. Out of scope, definitely. I think, I mean, I'm not an editor myself, but from what I hear from all the editorial boards that I have contact with, the out of scope papers, they don't really have a chance to get through to review. English is also an aspect where some of the editors and associate editors take time. And if they see the science is there and the research is primary and the insight is novel, so there's new information that is interesting, they sit down and they review and give advice to rewrite or restructure or rephrase. And also there are other services out there that an author could then go back and have his paper translated or rewritten. So these are two main topics where I think the editors actually take time and look at these papers and say they have a chance. You just need to look at these two aspects. I mean, these are the 2 points that I wanted to highlight because Raj, you did say everything that I was going to say.
May I just add something here, Julia, please?
Sure.
We love movies and we often look at movie reviews. So I'm going to take an analogy from the field of filmmaking. I recently read a review of a film and the reviewer started with the following sentences. He said, "We keep going to theaters with great hope and a lot of anticipation that the movie is going to be good." Similarly, Ludmil, my editor, and I open up our computers and start look at our website with great hope. We would love to see good papers. So we look at papers with great anticipation and not with a negative attitude, because we want each paper to be so good that it's going to be accepted very easily. Much to our disappointment, we find that the writing is careless or the scope is totally inappropriate. So we don't go in with a negative attitude to reject a paper. We go in with a very positive attitude. And every manuscript is looked at by at least 2 of us, the editor and myself. And most papers get looked at by what I've called the previewers, right? We've instituted something that we call the preview of a paper, which goes to one of our local experts, because I'm an immunologist, Professor Benov is a biochemist, molecular biologist, but we are not cardiologists and nephrologists and gastroenterologists. So we have experts, and they too tell me that they look at each paper with great hope. So I want to assure our viewers and audience that we look forward to receiving good papers. We don't go in as critics. Thank you.
Raj, just to provide some context, can you give us rough numbers of submissions and accepted manuscripts for MPP?
Right, good question. We get between 90 to 100 papers submitted every month. During the lockdown period, interestingly, after April of last year, the numbers kept going up, and we hit an all-time record of 121 submissions in the month of June and July. And that reflects the fact that people suddenly found time on their hands and scientists had the time to sit and submit papers. So we went down from 121, but we're back to about 100 submissions a month. And the rejection rate is, Muna, please correct me if I'm wrong, is somewhere about 92 to 93%. Am I right, Muna? Our rejection rate is around 92%.
Yeah, 92 was the last we calculated, yes.
Right, right. Which I'm told is a pretty high rejection rate. It reflects 2 things, I guess. It reflects the high submission rate, and it also reflects, I think, our being very selective. We publish 6 issues a year and not 12 issues, so it's not a monthly journal. We're looking at perhaps increasing the number of issues a year, but we get about 100 papers submitted a month, Julia.
All right, thank you very much. Gráinne, I'm sure you have very different answers to these questions. Can you highlight from an ethics point of view what would lead to automatic rejections?
Sure. But I first wanted to say that I loved Raj's metaphor there about the excitement of going to a movie every time, and I'm not an editor, but I do feel the same for every manuscript that comes in. You know, I was a scientist and I'm still excited to read science. But I also wanted to pick up on something that Raj said in the previous question, and that was about plagiarism and simultaneous submission to, say, MPP and another publisher or another journal. And this, you know, when you submit to MPP, you must sign a statement that says that it's not under consideration anywhere else. And this is then going and taking that manuscript and submitting it somewhere else is a clear violation of the statement that an author has agreed to. And we can completely understand the pressure to publish and, you know, the pressure to get that through review, but we really want to assure people that the best way to get your manuscript published is, as Muna has said and as Raj has said, is check the author guidelines, make sure that the manuscript you're submitting is suitable for the journal and, you know, meets the requirements. I also wanted to kind of expand a little bit on that point, which is about kind of text recycling more generally, where this is taking portions of text or sometimes even, you know, whole pages from other articles or either written by the authors themselves or somebody else, or kind of submitting a manuscript that is only it's based on the same participants, it's based on the same data, and there's, you know, maybe one additional variable added to the manuscript, but you fail to declare that actually, you know, we've published kind of 90% of the data that's in this manuscript elsewhere. And these kind of all together may lead to an automatic rejection. What I would encourage everybody again is, you know, as an author, be transparent. You know, if there is a reason why you've taken these paragraphs from another paper, for example, if it's, you know, a clinical definition, you can't, you know, it's very difficult to rephrase that, and in fact it might be inappropriate to rephrase that, but as, you know, putting that in quotation marks and referencing it appropriately is again just that transparency that we expect from authors. And similarly, there may be a reason why, you know, okay, 90% of this data is already published, but this new manuscript is really important, and here's why. And then, you know, Raj and his editorial board can make the decision. Whereas if that isn't disclosed, again, it goes back to not giving the editors and reviewers enough information to thoroughly review the manuscript, and that could lead to an automatic rejection.
All right, thank you very much. So I would suggest we move on to question number 3. So question number 3 would be, I would say that substandard submissions are a manifestation of the core issues of the publishing landscape, or more specifically of academic writing skills, from pressure to publish to lack of training. In your view, what is the main culprit in this context? Raj, I would like to start with you, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And I am not limiting you to just one culprit. You can name more than one.
Thank you. You're so generous, Julia. Thank you. I've now reached the age when I'm more than just a scientist or a professor. I realize that I've become a storyteller. So at the risk of boring the audience, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about my background. I come from India, and India is an old civilization. It had a very old tradition of having a guru, a spiritual teacher with a whole bunch of disciples, and they would be together 24/7. And in those days, they had a lot of time for mentoring, right? And I did my PhD 40 years ago in Canada. I had a wonderful supervisor, a guide, PhD advisor, who would spend hours with us. We would have coffee together, we would have lunch together, we would go to a cafe or a bar in the evening. And he would, in addition to talking about the world and politics and movies, he would use the time to talk to us about science. And much of the time he would talk to us about, without preaching, without appearing to preach or teach us, he would talk to us about publishing and the pitfalls of writing a substandard paper, about plagiarism. So even though we didn't have a formal course on how to write a paper, we learned a lot by just sitting and talking to seniors, other professors, who would be very happy to meet us by the water cooler or in the coffee room or in the seminar room and just share their wisdom. I think in 2021, that's missing now. Everyone's under pressure to write grants and get funding and go to conferences. And for example, I'm an editor, but I'm also a professor. I have my PhD and MSc students, my undergraduate medical school teaching. I'm on committees, budget committee, research committee, interview committees. So we have so many things that take our time away from the MPP editing room. And so I now understand why professors are not mentoring as much as they should. And that, I would say, is one of the major culprits. That I know that some of my colleagues are wonderful mentors. They talk to their students when they write their first paper. And they explain to them what is self-plagiarism. Because self-plagiarism is also plagiarism. I cannot escape by saying, oh, I just copy-pasted from my own paper, right, Gráinne? Because even that is plagiarism. Once I publish a paper, I just cannot copy-paste from there, unless I use inverted commas and I refer to that paper. So I would say a major culprit is lack of mentoring, which is something that I should do as a professor. Another thing is carelessness. And then this pressure to keep publishing. That I know that in some universities, people are not promoted, scientists are not promoted unless they publish X number of papers a year. And that leads to ethical mistakes. We know the famous proverb or slogan, which is publish or perish. There's a new proverb that I'm now realizing, which says you can perish even if you publish. If you publish unethically prepared manuscripts, you can perish because your reputation is going to be hurt. In MPP, we have a system of blacklisting authors who have clearly shown that they've submitted the same paper modified and then resubmitted to us. And that's grounds for not just rejection, but it's grounds for long-term blocking from submitting to our journal. So I would say the two major grounds for the two major culprits are poor mentoring by us, that is the scientific community, and the pressure that is real. I'm not even saying it's an unreal pressure. It's a pressure to keep publishing. So we do shortcuts and we are careless, and then papers are rejected. Those are my two major culprits, Julio.
Thank you very much. Gráinne Muna, do you have something to add from your point of view?
Yes, I would just like to underline what Raj said, but from, again, a slightly different view. Lack of interest, I think definitely is probably one of the main reasons that the authors just want to meet a goal that they have to publish within this time, but what happens with their publication afterwards and where it's published and if there will be any impact with their research or based on their research, that's the follow-up or the impact that they don't care for. Simply, they just want to meet their short-term goal, which is that they have to have a publication within an impact factor journal. I think also lack of resources, that authors do not have the resources to train themselves or to receive training, free available courses for how to do research. Because for me, it begins before the publishing. If the author knows how to do proper research and what is needed there, then they would automatically be led to the right path to provide the output of their research in properly documented papers. Just my 2 cents on the whole thing, that authors need support in many other ways as well. That's it.
Thank you.
And if I may, I'll just follow on from Muna's point to say that I think that, you know, as a journal, we have a responsibility to make it clear to authors what they need to do to kind of get that manuscript into review and get it accepted, you know, and whether that's having a lot of information on scope about what kind of manuscripts we're willing to consider, or what information, you know, the author guidelines, like what information needs to be in that manuscript for it to proceed to review. As well, you know, as Muna and Raj rightly pointed out, the study needs to have been executed well and then the manuscript needs to be written up well. You know, these are 2 points, and I think that as a journal we can give authors a lot of guidance on how they can meet our expectations.
All right, thank you very much. I would say we move on to the next question. Just question number 4, which would be, can you describe initiatives from your daily work to raise the standards of submissions? Gráinne, if we could start with you, would that be okay?
Yeah, I think this, you know, will lead on quite nicely from what I was just saying. So for, again, picking up on that optimism, we really want manuscripts to come in that are ready for review. You know, we don't want to reject, you know, good quality science. And so what I'm doing in collaboration with my colleagues is making our author guidelines as clear as possible for authors to understand what is needed, and whether that is what statements are needed, what sections need to be in a, you know, a research article versus a review article. And fortunately, if you go to the author guidelines page for MPP, you can actually download article templates. So you don't need to worry about, okay, where on the website do I find the references style? Where do I find their policy on, you know, conflict of interests? In fact, if you download the template for a research article because you know that's what you want to write, all of that information is there. And so we really want to make it as easy as possible for authors to submit a manuscript that Raj and his colleagues are going to look at and say, yeah, this is great science, this is really clearly and understandably written, I'll send this for review. And so we really want to provide as much information as possible to authors so that their manuscript is not one of these substandard manuscripts.
All right, thank you. Muna, your take?
Yeah, yes. I think publishers can provide a lot of support, like Gráinne said earlier. We do. Karger definitely has tools and courses and possibilities for authors to educate themselves. One aspect I also introduce in my board or my journals to train the boards on what is expected, to train the board members, because board members are also reviewers. And if we highlight to them what we need them to look at and how we want our manuscripts to be submitted, I think that helps a lot, because they give that feedback to the authors, and the next time the author writes a paper, he will write it with that knowledge, whether to us or to someone else. But I think that's another path of passing on the information and the knowledge through the editorial board.
All right, very interesting. Raj?
If you look at the key players in this whole game of publishing, we should look at the author, the publisher, the editor, and the reviewers. And upfront, I'm totally comfortable saying that Karger as publishers are doing a great job. They keep, for example, the template that Gráinne mentioned. And Muna, who is my, I would call her my publishing manager, she keeps talking to us about working on the guidelines, improving the guidelines, making the guidelines more explicit, doing things to facilitate the author's submission, and we are totally happy with that. In an ideal world, this is what an editor-in-chief or an editor should do. For every rejection, they should take the time and the space needed to give a detailed explanation on why the paper is rejected. I'm talking about editor rejection, because when it's a peer-reviewed rejection, we enclose, we add the reviewer's comments, and everything is explicit. But when we do an editor rejection, in an ideal world, if I had all the time in the world, I would take the time to actually say that your paper is of extremely local interest, or you don't have a clear rationale, or your results are not convincing, or your sample numbers are too small, or we are not convinced about the techniques that you used. But because I'm also a scientist and a professor and an administrator, unfortunately, I don't have the time to do it. The second reason why we haven't been doing it is we don't want to get into a dialogue with the author, because if the author comes back to rebut or to argue the case, I could be spending days just getting into a dialogue with the author, and we want to avoid that. We would ideally like to give an explanation and leave it at that. But many a time we find that authors get into a long dialogue that, what do you mean by this, and so on. But what I do at my level is we look at the peer-reviewed comments when it's a rejection, and we add to that and give an explanation for why a manuscript is being rejected. What I'm doing as a professor and a scientist is, a few years ago, Kuwait University started a course that's called Scientific Writing and Communication Skills for MSc and PhD students. And this course has been made a compulsory course. If you want to graduate from Kuwait University, you must take this course and you must get a certain grade for it. What does this course teach? It starts with how to write a grant proposal, how to write a scientific paper, how to write a thesis, and how to give a seminar. And we have about 6 to 7 lectures of 1.5 hours each on how to write a scientific paper. We start with what is a paper, all the way to how to write and submit a paper and how to defend reviewers' comments. And I find that I enjoy teaching that course because, and I give those lectures personally, even though we have several other teachers in the course. I enjoyed this course because this gives me a chance to share what I've learned over the years when I was a PhD student to a postdoctoral fellow to a professor, and I look at it as giving back to the scientific community. And we have students coming back to us a year or 2 years down the line saying, Dr. Raj, your course helped me because I was able to defend when I saw the reviewers' comments and my paper was accepted. And that gives me a lot of fulfillment. Unfortunately, many universities don't do that. Now, Kuwait University is one of the best medical schools in the Middle East and the Gulf, but we are nowhere on the international scale. So if Kuwait University can do this, I'm sure many other universities can do this even better, because you have scientists and you have professors, you have authors. So if all universities start doing this, students would learn not just at the lunch table or at coffee, but they would learn it in a formal way. So these are some of the things that I wish I could do and I'm not able to do, and some of the things that I am able to do as an editor. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our little discussion. I can see we've already gathered some questions to the audience. If you have any other questions, please put them into the chat box. I'm going to very quickly introduce 2 services that Karger can offer. This is not going to take more than 2 minutes. So as you've probably heard from Muna and from Raj, we as a publisher have encountered the problem of formatting and language as one of the most crucial problems when we look at submissions. We have partnered with Inago, a leading provider for author services, in order to provide solutions for these issues. We also have a self-service learning platform that's called kargerlearn.com. Do take a look if you're interested. It has online courses. Do get in touch with us or with your regional representative if you're interested in a closer look. So I would now move to the, I forgot. Karger has also published an ebook on especially all the topics that we raised today. It is called How to Get Your Biomedical Paper Published. It is a guide for graduate students and postdocs. Again, if you're interested, do let us know. Feel free to contact us anytime. So we would move to the question and answer section. I will open up the questions that we have gathered so far. So I'm going to read the question. The first question would be, if not done in our country, is it not enough reason to do the study? I am not sure I understand this question. It is probably referring to the topic of very specific research done in a very specific part of the world. Raj, do you want to maybe give some more information on that?
Sure. I'll start off by giving specific examples. For example, Kuwait is a small country, but it has several districts. As an example of a paper which is of extremely local interest is comparison of pollen grains in this area versus that area. That is of interest to the Ministry of Public Health in Kuwait, and it's certainly of interest to the asthma and the respirologists in the country, but it's of no interest to a researcher in China or Switzerland or Canada or the United States. Another example would be emergency wheelchair ramps in 5 hospitals of Kuwait. Now, this is of great interest to the Ministry of Public Health and the hospital director, but someone sitting in Hungary or Japan or Australia is not going to be very interested in the number of wheelchair ramps in a hospital in my country, right? That's an example of something of local interest. On the other hand, if there is a paper that says severity of COVID-19 disease in Kuwait in March versus December, that could be of potential interest to a researcher in Australia or Papua New Guinea, because they're going to compare it with what's happening in their country. So when I say of extreme local interest, this is what I mean. Now in Kuwait, we also have a journal that's called Kuwait Medical Journal. In Saudi Arabia, they have a journal called Saudi Medical Journal. Now those are highly localized journals of great readership within the country. So when we get a paper like this, and we get an angry author walking into my office or phoning me, I guide them that, look, let's sit down, let me explain this to you. But your paper is going to be of interest. It's publishable, but it's going to have very local interest. And we guide them to the Kuwait Medical Journal. We also show them citations, and we say that, look, here's a paper that was published 6 years ago. And you know what the number of citations for that paper is? It's a grand total of 0. And we give them classic examples, we give them concrete examples and try to convince them. I hope this has answered the question that where should I go if it's of local interest? Unfortunately, it has to go to another local or regional journal.
May I just add one little information, is that the scope of every journal usually tells the author whether the journal is focusing on local or regional matters, medical, or if it's more of an international journal that seeks global medical issues. So the scope usually helps the authors to know, and also the title, obviously, like our journal in Saudi Arabia, SJ8, Saudi Journal of Research in Health Systems, is very local. So it addresses local Saudi and regional issues. Just to say that not all local papers or papers that address local issues are rejected, just have to fit the scope.
All right, thank you very much.
May I just come in with another quick example? Just yesterday, we got a paper from India which talked about polymorphisms of a certain gene that leads to a chronic lymphocytic leukemia. At first glance, it looked extremely local, but then when we read the abstract and read the results and the discussion, the author had very beautifully explained that this was the first time they had seen polymorphisms of genes that has not been reported anywhere else. But the title got us the impression that it's a very local paper. And now we've sent that paper for review and we're taking it to the next step, even though it looks local, but Ludmil Benov and I see chances of citation because it's showing some polymorphisms that have not been reported elsewhere. And eventually this paper is accepted, recommended by peer reviewers. We're going to advise the authors to make the title look less local, right? So again, I want to give that example of walking into a movie and having a lot of optimism that the movie is going to be good. We want the papers to have international implications.
All right, thank you very much.
Can I just jump in? And this is sort of a question for Raj, but I think is of interest to everybody. So would you think that this kind of goes back to maybe some mentorship that's needed in, for want of a better word, selling your manuscript? You know, that I believe this is of international interest, and here's why.
Yes, absolutely. And Gráinne, we shouldn't hesitate to use the word selling the manuscript, even though it looks very, it sounds very mercenary and business-like. But basically, when I'm trying to give a seminar, I'm selling my work, I'm selling myself. When I go to an interview, I'm selling myself. When I send a paper for publication, I am selling my work. So absolutely right phrase to use, yes. So again, it goes back to mentorship. To people like me, if I'm a professor, I should try to get my students to make the title, and I apologize for this phrase, to make the title sexy enough to sell.
Yeah, and I mean, not only to sell, but also to read, right? I mean,
absolutely.
I would rather read a sexy article.
Yes. And for you, Muna, as my publisher, and for me as an editor, the bottom line is still the number of citations. We don't want to just publish. We want the papers to be read. We want a large number of people to read it and then to cite it. So impact factor becomes our bottom line. And for impact factor, it's the citation numbers that become the bottom line.
Yes, the impact factor is important, but from a publisher's view and from my personal view, there are many other things that are important as well. To pass on the knowledge, whether the article is cited or not. So there's the one aspect and there's the other one.
True.
All right, we have another question which refers to systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And I think this falls into the topic of maybe quoting oneself or quoting other articles. Can you elaborate on whether there are different rules for these article types?
Raj, do you want to jump in or do you want me to take this?
Can you start, Gráinne? I'll add to it.
Sure. In general, the answer is no. The rules are the same regardless of what the manuscript type is. To compare to a research article, maybe your methodology is exactly the same as another methodology, because by rephrasing it, you would actually lose information. And again, it goes back to what I was saying at the start. It's about being transparent about what you have done. So if it is important that you reproduce a paragraph from another article in your systematic review, you need to do that transparently. So that's putting it in quotation marks and citing it. It's also worth bearing in mind that a lot of articles may have copyright concerns on them. So if you are reproducing a lot of text from an article, you need to check that that article's copyright allows you to do that. And so, for example, if it's open access, that you can reproduce text, and as long as it's appropriately attributed, normally there isn't any copyright concerns. You may need to, it may be advisable to seek permission from the author to do that. Whereas another article might, the copyright might belong to the publisher, and the publisher will have rules about how much text can be reproduced without seeking permission. And so I'd always advise you to look at, if you are looking to reproduce text in your systematic review or meta-analysis, check the copyright and check the guidelines of the journal from which that article is published in, to make sure that there aren't any problems down the line. Because as Raj pointed out earlier, we don't want you as an author to run into any kind of ethical problems post-publication that may damage your reputation. So it's, it's best to be informed, basically, and be transparent about what's been done in the manuscript.
Gráinne, thank you. You made it so clear from a plagiarism and ethics point of view. I'm just going to take it one step further and talk about reviews. We get two kinds of reviews. One is an invited review, where Dr. Benov and I look at internationally reputed, high credibility scientists and request them, please, can you submit a review article to us? We call that an invited review. Another kind is an unsolicited review, of which we get quite a few each month. And the first thing we do is to go and look at the author's presence in the field. We look at the H index of the author, and we look at whether the author has published at least a few papers in that particular area that he or she is reviewing. I shouldn't claim to be an expert and submit a review and I've published no papers in that particular field, right? So several times we have to not even consider a review because we realize that it's a PhD student who submitted his thesis and has the time to write a review. And we don't consider that an expert review. And yes, we want reviewers to cite their own papers because it shows us that he or she has a presence in the field, has published a few papers in the field. But all of the self-citation should be done with a careful eye on the ethics and the professionalism aspect of it, which Gráinne has covered so well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One last question before we close this session. My institute does not support young authors. Can you tell me where I can find material and information to self-educate?
May I come in? Because
Sure.
when I prepared for this course on scientific writing and communication skills, I had two sources of information. One was my own experience of being a student, postdoc, scientist in the field. I pulled from my own experience. Another was just Googling, and I found some remarkable publications, websites on how to write a grant proposal, how to write a paper, and several editors of journals who are eminent scientists themselves have written very nice papers on how to successfully publish a paper. Journal of Clinical Investigation, for example, came out with the editor, wrote a beautiful paper on do's and don'ts on writing papers. So just Googling, I find, leads to remarkable resources on how to publish. And I wish all universities actually spent the time and the resources on educating young, enthusiastic researchers like the person who asked this question. But failing that, I find that the internet is a great source of information. And I've gained wonderful nuggets of wisdom that I've incorporated in my lectures and seminars.
I would just like to add, as I mentioned previously as well, the publisher's homepage usually provides a lot of information.
Yes.
And refers to guidelines and refers to other readings. So it's a good start to go there.
Yeah.
I agree.
May I add here that,
Sorry, Raj, go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. I'm not a Karger employee, so upfront, that's my disclaimer. Having said that, I should say that Karger has shown me over the years that they're really serious about educating youngsters and young researchers. So I find the Karger websites are a great source of which lead us to resources. So I would encourage the person who asked this question to actually visit Karger's websites, which leads to some very nice resources on writing papers.
Thank you very much. I would suggest we close this session here. I would like to thank the speakers, especially Raj. Thank you guys very much for your insights. It was very interesting. Thank you to the audience for your time and your attention. I hope you found this useful and maybe entertaining. And thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. And bye-bye.